7. Non vultus non colour. The urchin was trying to move the rock, but it was too big for him to manage alone. It was bigger than anything in the whole world. His ball had rolled down a crack under the boulder, and his arm was too short to reach it. When he pushed against the stupid rock, he saw his face clearly reflected in its shiny surface where the dust had wiped away. He gave up and clambered down the mound of rubble, the remains of a side wall that had fallen away from one of the buildings. He lay back next to a tuft of dry white grass. He tried to sleep, because the dreams he had were far better than staying awake. The dreams were in fierce colour, like the stars, not shades of grey like the world. It was no good. The brittle grass stalks scratched at his skin. Wide awake, he stared up at the angular grey walls that towered over him. Above them, stars winked in the black sky. In his satchel, he still had a couple of the biscuits from the machine. He had given the rest to Shonzi, as usual, so he had to make these last. 2 bells ago, he had found some berries growing along one of the artery alleys. Shonzi had told him not to touch them, but they were so glossy and moist that he couldn't resist a couple. He had been sick for a whole bell, and Shonzi had said, "I told you so." His stomach still felt like someone else's, but he was really hungry and managed half of the dry biscuit. He had some water too, that Shonzi had bought from the hose spring. Shonzi always knew what was best. Sometimes one of the others, usually Amnoni, would give him some of their food. She would leave it on a ledge somewhere when the guards were not there. He would creep out to take it and sometimes see the work gang watching him from a distance. But they never approached him, and he just snatched the food and ran. Sometimes it was the food he had given Shonzi to give to them. He never told Shonzi about that either, because he wanted anything he could get. He heard a high, raucous chitter-chatter and darted for cover into the shadows of a doorway. Guards were coming, their armoured feet tramping in the dust. He peered out of the doorway and saw them pass the end of the alley, marching in a single line along the main artery towards the dial square. The starlight glinted off their eyes and burnt red, polished heads like the scuttlers in the rubble and dung. The Goik was with the guards too. The urchin hated the Goik. The Goik had trapped him once on the middle phase and nearly torn his arm off, dragging him towards the watchtower. Shonzi had caught up with them just outside the gates. The urchin had run off while Shonzi and the Goik were bashing each other up. He hid where no one would find him and tried not to cry. But Shonzi still knew where he was. He was hugged and rocked gently as Shonzi said, "It's all right, kid, it's all right. As long as you're all right, I'm all right." It was quiet again. The guards had gone. The urchin went back to the mound of rubble. He hunted round for something to use and found an old table leg that would be a good lever to lift the rock. The captain of the Faisal work gang sat sullenly on his own, a little way from the rest of the group. The other 3 squatted around a makeshift fire built from the overroots and splintered furniture that they had gathered during the Bell day's work. The firelight painted fresh shadows up the grey buildings on this corner of the Dial Square, deserted colonnades and balconies long fallen into disrepair or simply fallen, briefly touched with flickering gold. The air was still. The smoke rose in a straight, unbroken column into the dark sky. Beyond the fire glow was only star silver and dull, drained grey. The Faisal gang were not cold, despite their ragged overalls and stolen greatcoats. Their eyes were so accustomed to the twilight that they no longer recognised it as anything but normal. But the fire they habitually built had a life of its own. The crew could stare mindlessly into the flames, letting the flickering shapes fill their empty thoughts. Any desperate thing to pass the time. The captain unfolded the crumpled piece of paper he had studied any number of times before. "I am Quenisander Olyesti Pakari, first son of the house of Fordfarding. My mother was Olyes Dryanosor. Her mother was Dryana Shailvarsor, and her foremother was Shailvar Kariesti." It meant less each time he stared at it, and he still remembered nothing new. A head full of memories that might be just imagination. Nothing he was certain of. "Captain," said Amnoni Distoyesor quietly. He looked up and saw Vale moving out of the greyness towards them. The young man had a new jacket, dark green with gold cord at the shoulders. He almost swaggered with a cruel confidence. Captain Peccary rose wearily. He pulled forward his lank greying hair so that it covered the purple scar on the left side of his face. The other Phasals kept their places, staring too fixedly into the fire, listening as he spoke for them. "Well?" said Vale. Peccary shook his head. He looked sidelong at Vale with his good eye. "You've been told before." There was a nervous tick that Vale gave to his head when he was angry, as if he was biting back his words. He feigned a smile. "Where do you think that'll get you?" "We'll see." "You're half-starving as it is, Peccary. The process is getting angry. My crew won't work in that section of the city. It's dangerous down there. It has a bad feeling. None of us goes further in than the Hollow Hand." Vale turned sharply towards the others. "You're superstitious idiots," he accused. "You're given food and you fling it away. And where's Shonzi? Still living off your scraps? He'll be caught soon. He can't escape it." Peccary stayed silent, so Vale smiled profusely again and put on his infants and idiots voice. "This is what the process told me to tell you. That section of the city is subject to minor static shifts. Nothing dangerous. All you've seen is electrical discharge, not a haunting." Ryoga stood up, his burly form in his long coat dwarfed Vale. "I've seen figures and shapes down there," he insisted angrily. "And Chesspearl's heard voices too, crying and wailing." "It was something in pain," said Chesspearl. She moved in close to Ryogus, her face thin and drawn with concern. "A horrible sound." "We've all heard it," added Amnoni. "None of us goes into that section now, not since the beginning." Vale clenched his teeth. "Then how do you know about figures and shapes?" "You go in there then," snapped Ryogus, "or send the process. I want to see how that filthy thing deals with it." They had begun to close in around Vale, slowly drawing a knot. His eyes darted from one haggard face to another. "That section is not haunted," he repeated tightly. "The process drove the evil out of the world in the beginning. We know that. We were all there." "Perhaps its memory lingers," said Peccary. The knot was drawing tighter, forcing Vale closer to the fire. Its flames blazed eagerly up in a sudden crackle of sparks. Vale began to panic. "I can't go on pleading with the process forever," he insisted. "And there'll be no more food until you continue the search." "But you're not starving, are you?" emphasised Ryogus. "Far from it, you little rat." He put a massive hand on Vale's shoulder and pulled at the gold cord. "Guards!" whispered Chesspearl. 3 guards were placed in a line halfway across the dial. No closer yet, because the threat would be enough. Their eyes, like bunches of red berries on their armoured heads, twitched as they watched. "You can let me go now," said Vale. Ryogus glanced at Peccary for instruction. One of the guards slowly unwound a segmented whip. Peccary looked determined. "Tell the process that we will work in the section—" "What?" interrupted Amnoni Distuyisor. Vale was beginning to grin, but Peccary raised a hand. "We will work in that section when we get more food, and if you come with us." Ryogus laughed out loud. He shoved Vale towards the guards, ripping away the gold shoulder cord as he did so. "Whoops," he said. The collaborator turned and faced them. His head ticked nervously again as he pushed a hand through his long red hair. "Tell Shonzi that we want him, and the little one too. Soon." He walked hurriedly from the square, the guards following and chittering as they went. There was no more to be said. They were thought-blind and alone. Each of them alone in their thoughts. Speech was not always enough to communicate frustration or love. They had been Chronauts, now they were Phasals. But they were still a crew, truly individuals, but still together. They returned to their places by the fire, Peccary settling down on the ground away from the rest, his head resting on a mound of dried lichen as he tried to sleep. Chesspearl and Ryogus huddled together, wrapped in their coats and staring into the depths of the fire. From a ragged pocket, Amnoni pulled a scrap of paper. "I believe I was born Amnoni Distuyisor Lorizon, daughter of the house of Blyledge. My father is an old and ancient one, but I cannot remember it any more. I believe that I was the oldest daughter. I was born to be a mother and a Kithriarch. When will I ever gain my birthright? Somewhere there was the fractured chime of a cracked bell. Ace's eyes were stinging. She had opened them and they were full of dust. It was pitch dark and she had to keep rubbing them with her fists until they watered away the burning. She coughed, nearly choked. Her throat was raw and she was full up with dust. She froze, not knowing where she was, and no way of knowing. The dust was clinging all over her, coarse and itchy. She reached into the dark with her hands. The floor where she had been lying was rough and stony. You've fallen on stony ground, Ace. Of course, that was her name, Ace. She'd been trying to remember. She pushed upwards and was showered with loose stones and sand from some sort of roof just over her head. The instinct to panic shuddered through her, but she forced it back down again. She sat, unable to move in the darkness, her breath coming in short bursts, trying to keep up with her racing brain. Why would anyone want to bury her alive? She couldn't be tombed up. There was air in here. It was prickly with dry dust. But if she'd been dead, she wouldn't have needed air till now, would she? So maybe... She was ravenously hungry too. She could murder a bag of chips. Not so much a bag, more a rucksack. Then she remembered the TARDIS, and events came jumbling back uninvited into her head. She shivered and sat praying that it was more than just a memory, even if it was over now. It had been like this when she first got to Iceworld, blasted out of existence on Earth by a freak chronometeorological event that turned out to be no freak at all, left stranded on a distant planet where, by Machiavellian design, she would accidentally run into the Doctor. She was aching all over, just as she had ached then. Was it another time storm? Perhaps time storms followed her about. Or maybe she caused them. It had ripped apart the Doctor's ship. The TARDIS had disintegrated around her, and so everything in it had been hurled out of one existence, spilling across the time and space continua between which the ship slipped, her included. Chucked out into reality, any time, any space. Everything was all gone. She sat and waited for it to hit her, but her thoughts were numb. She had to find the Doctor, and that wasn't logical. It was instinct, but he had gone too, hadn't he? She couldn't even start getting her head around that, so she sat, exhausted, aching, famished, and bloody dusty. Something was tapping close by. There was a chink of bluish light just above her eyeline. Something black was pushing through the gap. It poked her in the arm. "Oi!" she shouted. The stick or rod stopped moving for a moment and then began to push like a lever. "Doctor? Is that you?" yelled Ace. "I'm in here, get me out!" Her throat clogged with dust and her nose began to stream. She set her hands to the roof and heaved through a shower of grit. The darkness exploded away in a tumble of shining rocks. Ace burst out into the light like a jack-in-the-box. She lay for a moment, half in, half out of her cell, trying to get her breath back. There was something in her hand. She lifted her head and looked at it. A small blue ball, battered with a chunk missing and the flaking shapes of gold eyes stamped all over it. She closed her own eyes again and felt sick. Something moved near her. She looked up and saw a kid staring at her. He was halfway down the pile of rubble, so his head was level with hers. A scruffy, mucky kid, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with wild ginger hair and sunken blue eyes. "Hello," croaked Ace warily. "I'm Ace." He was scared as hell, but he kept glancing down at her hand. "Is this yours?" she said. There was no answer, so she raised her hand and the ball tumbled away down the slope. The kid grabbed it. He stared at her for a second and then turned and ran. "Thanks a bunch," said Ace. She closed her eyes again and lay for what seemed like a day in the state of half-sleep that at least pushed the worst possibilities of reality away. When she opened her eyes again, it didn't seem to be later at all. The grey twilight was the same, the air was the same. She was still hungry. She scrambled slowly out of the hole and looked at her surroundings. She was at one end of a narrow alley. perched halfway up a mound of rubble. The grey remains of a part-collapsed building reared over her. Its interior was revealed in jagged cross-section, but there were no rooms or levels inside. It was a hollow shell or fascia, all grey with false windows and balconies applied to the outside, but leading nowhere. Ornate moulded shapes like the outlines in a kid's colouring book waiting to be painted in. The building on the other side, which was undamaged, more or less mirrored the shape of the remains of the collapsed building. A matching pair once. They inclined towards each other as they went higher until they almost touched at their roofs. Through the gap overhead she saw a sprinkling of coloured stars, one of which, a gold sodium giant, was bright enough to cast a shadow in the grey twilight. Ace walked to the end of the alley and looked cautiously out onto the main street. The place was deserted. Other buildings or fasciae lined the curving thoroughfare. There was nothing symmetrical to their layout. They were slung together in a silent cacophony of muddled styles, as if a number of drunken architects had pooled their ideas together, and this was the result. It was weird and wonderful. Archways and overwalks tangled with pillars and balustrades. Roofs and towers in disparate sculpted forms rose up on all sides around her, fading into the distance as if she was standing at the foot of a basin or valley. A giant might have tilted the ground so that the buildings slid together in a teetering jumble and were left where they had collided. Stone in the form of birds' wings and curlicues, geometric shapes like carved fruit and prisms, vast astragals without their columns, an edifice like the prow of a beached ship, all of them grey, many of them crumbling or tumble down. Rubble lay strewn in piles where it had fallen, and no one had cleared it away. And there was a bizarre scattering of furniture too. An iron bedstead was emerging sideways through the brickwork, about 15 feet up a wall. A mirror, with a carved oval frame, hung on another wall, its glass splintered. Through its cracks grew the branches of a white tree. The place's craziness was difficult to take in, harder still to look at. The way it piled up around Ace was oppressive, even dizzying. She was right at its centre. The city around her dwarfed the sky overhead. But what a sky! There was no sky like this anywhere near Earth. The constellations seen from Earth were miserable and pale. These stars were fierce like warriors. They burned in red, blue or white, green, purple or gold. A nebula of interstellar gases splashed the sky directly overhead, diffused with smoky blue and pink from the distant torches of the stars around it. Ace was dazzled by this. It was exactly the sort of thing she had wanted the doctor to show her. Well, Cosmic! As a kid she had looked up at the night sky, dull in the glare of street lamps, and said, "Listen, God, if you want to prove you exist, show me what it's like on another planet. I want to dream it tonight, okay? Then I'll know you're really real." She never dreamt it, but God might have just been playing hard to get. And now the doctor had gone too. So it was up to her. "You're on your own again, Ace," said God. "Thanks for that, God. Cheers." She knew there were others in the city, tramps and scavengers probably. No one else would stay in this derelict bomb site. If the doctor was here, he would have made contact with them. By now he would either be established as their new leader, or be top of their most wanted person list. She could guess which side she'd land up on. She had nothing to eat, and nothing to protect herself with, and she had a hell of a reputation to live up to. Everything she owned had been in the TARDIS, but what she missed most was her Nitro 9. She couldn't even guard her own back without that. She plunged her hands through her pockets and produced 2 leaky biros and a packet of fluffy mints. She scraped one of the sweets off and chewed it. At least it felt like eating. In an inside pocket she found the TARDIS key and the scroll. She had forgotten about them, but they were no good to anyone now, and only the doctor could know what the scroll was for. That was something else she'd screwed up over. It was all her fault. She should have found him and handed over the scroll when he could have done something with it. An involuntary shudder coursed down her spine. The street was no longer silent. She heard a choking wheeze close by and ducked back up the alley. Something was approaching. The desperate gasp of air was followed by a dull, slithering squelch, and then a venomous reptilian hiss. Wheeze, squelch, hiss. The pattern slowly repeated itself again and again as its author drew steadily nearer. Wheeze, squish, sss. Ace pushed herself into a doorway, but the handle was false and wouldn't budge. There was no time to run, and she was too scared to move. What was coming was a horror. Something massively vile and evil, heaving an effortful way along the deserted street towards her alley. The progress stopped. Ace felt faint. Her stomach gurgled like a megawatt sound system. She leaned forward slightly, hearing the short, gasping breaths of the creature as it lingered just out of her sight. There was a stench like rotting potatoes. Hiss, rasp, sludge. It moved on again. Ace pressed herself flat into the recess and stared at the opening. The monster's star shadow lurched across the mouth of the alley. She turned her face away, eyes screwed tight, teeth clenched, dreading the worst. It was right there in the opening. Then the repulsive sounds passed on, gradually fading as their owner moved away. The stench slowly dispersed. Ace breathed again. What you smell, you eat, a memory reminded her. She lost her appetite. Minutes counted on her racing heart before she dared edge out of the doorway. The same numbing silence had returned. She made her way to the alley mouth and looked out. The street was empty again. She stepped forward and knelt on the road. A feeling of sickness which had started in the pit of her empty stomach was welling up into her throat. Along the dusty ground, just as she had feared, ran a line of single oval footprints, layered in glistening slime. She had seen the same tracks before, leading from the back of the doctor's splintered chest of books into the crack in the TARDIS walls. It was the same creature, somehow transported here just as she had been. Only here, in this desolate city, it was leaving tracks 100 times bigger.